this video I'm going to be looking at making a steampunk mask. Now as you can see, here's a sketch that I've made of the idea, and the idea is that it's a leather mask which has been covered with various metal components and cables and other steampunk gizmos. Now I need to acknowledge my sources, and this was partially inspired by these guys. Now this is from the Teen Wolf TV series, the remake of the film from the 80s, and I don't know if the TV show's any good, but hats off to the costume department. These guys look fantastic, so I was quite inspired to do something like this. Now I guess these guys themselves were also inspired by various other masks that have come out in films and TV, and one that I think they may have been inspired by was the bad guy from Hellboy, Cronin. That's him there, and as you can see they've all got that sort of similar steampunk look, a sort of a goggle type design for the eyes, and then a blank featureless mask. So I really like the idea of that, and I'm going to have a go at doing one for myself. Now this is intended for the Asylum, the steampunk festival that I go to every year in Lincoln. Here's me from the previous year wearing my steampunk exosuit arm, and if you're interested in how I put that together, have a look at my video series. I'll put a link in the description. Now for several years my friends have had their own steampunk troupe, the Imperial Etheric Airways, and as you can see here they are. As you can see, they've got their own unique Union Jack look to their costumes, and I've been saying for several years that I should actually make one myself and to fully become part of the troupe, so now's the time. So this piece is also going to be painted in Union Jack colours to fit in with their troupe. So the first thing to think about is how to get some nice curved pieces to replicate what you see in the sketch. So what I'm going to do is follow a similar approach that I took to making my science fiction mask from a few videos ago. So what I've got here is a mannequin, and I've got some foam in the oven. And what I'm going to do is bend that foam around the head of the mannequin so that it will match the contours of the head. Now handling the mannequin's head is about the same size as mine, so that means it's going to more or less fit me. So there's my foam, and as you can see it's quite wobbly, so it's been in the oven for quite some time. That also means that it's quite hot though, probably too hot for me to touch for any length of time. So what I'm going to do is wrap some cloth around the foam and press it onto the contours of the mannequin's head. And I discovered when I did this for my science fiction mask that what you really need is sort of 3 or 4 sets of arms to fully grab the foam and hold it in place. Unfortunately I don't have those, so a piece of cloth will do just as well. Right, so there's my piece of foam, and I think I've got enough of a workable area there to allow me to cut out the pieces that I need. So I've just trimmed that down into a slightly more manageable size, and now I'm just marking out the area that I need. The mask's got a kind of asymmetric look, so it's mostly the right hand side of the face that's covered. So I'm just drawing out a shape that will cover the right hand side of the face from the eyes up to just before the ears. Now what I've also got are these things which are called brass bushings, which I think are used in plumbing, but everybody I know uses them for goggle lens holders, so they look quite nice. So that's how they're going to sit there. I'm figuring the smaller one up the top is some form of sensor rather than being like a third eye or anything like that, but it sort of looks slightly alien, which I think is cool, sort of gives it a slightly more steampunk look. So there's my piece of foam cut out now. What I need to do is make some shaped pieces of foam to hold those lens holders in place. The way I'm doing that is by cutting out some strips of foam and rolling them into cylinders and then gluing them onto the curved piece that I already have. So the next thing I need is a respirator. What I've got here is a plastic respirator which I think is intended for clubbing. Now what I initially intended to do was to make a pattern of this, trace that out into foam, cut it out and make a foam copy of it. But the foam copy didn't really come out all that well, so in the end I thought, well, I might as well just use the mask itself. So that's what I've done. So as you can see here, that's how the basic layout of the mask is going to look. So I've got my foam pieces for the eyes and face, and I've got my rubber respirator piece down the bottom. So one problem that I ran into when I made my previous foam mask was the flexibility of the foam. Now I know that there are various methods for dealing with this. I've seen some people coat the foam in PVA glue, other people give it a coat of a thick spray paint called Plasti-Dip. All of those methods do seem to retain some flexibility to the foam though, and I really don't need that in this case because this is basically a helmet and my head is not going to move. The pieces can be rigid, so what I'm going to do is cover them in fiberglass. Now what that is a layer of glass fibre. So here I've got two types. I've got a tissue glass fibre and also a heavier chopped strand mat. What you do is you take some resin, and in this case it's the same polyester resin that I've used for various projects in the past. You give it a layer of polyester resin, and then you basically laminate in your glass fibre. When that dries, it dries to a very lightweight but very hard shape. Now one thing I'm trying that's slightly new is to use a silicone brush. Now one problem that you have with resin is that when it dries hard, and unless you clean your brush, that just ruins the brush because it just solidifies and you can't use it again. Now because the only thing that sticks to silicone is silicone, I'm thinking that if I use a silicone brush I can literally just peel off the resin once it's dry and reuse the brush. So we'll see how that goes. As you can see, I really do need a workshop because my glass fibre is blowing all over the place in the garden. The thing is, the polyester resin really does have a very strong chemical smell, so it's really not a good idea to do this in the house unless you're happy with your house smelling of chemicals for the next few days. So as you can see, the basic principle is give it a coat of resin, then add on your glass fibre. And what you do is you just keep building this up in very thin layers, so you sort of laminate it all together. I'm starting off with my tissue glass fibre. My thinking here is that I don't want it to get too heavy while it's wet and to deform the foam. So I'm just putting on a very light coat first. I'm going to let that dry so it's got a degree of structural strength. Then I'm going to come in with the heavier glass fibre to give it some real structural strength. And it's the same process for all the other pieces, so the other eyepiece and the respirator are all getting a coating of fiberglass as well. The respirator is only a thin plastic, so it's quite flexible, but it'll be really rigid once I've got the fiberglass on there. So now that the resin's dry, I can see if I can actually peel this off my silicone brush, and actually that's come off pretty easily. It's quite an interesting pattern actually. Anyway, that's handy, so it does mean I can reuse these brushes, so that should hopefully save a bit of money in the long run. So I've let that dry, and as you can see that's now pretty tough. I'm not going to, but I'm pretty sure that if I stood on that, that would actually hold me up. So it really is that strong, so it's useful stuff, despite the slightly messy process of creating it. I have to say glass fibre strands do tend to get everywhere, and the resin itself smells, can poison you, and also can burn you if you're not too careful. The other thing to be careful of is fiberglass splinters. Those things can be really painful, so be careful. So one other thing I've done is to also give us another coat of a thixotropic resin. So that's basically the same polyester resin but a thicker paste-like version. So I've just given it a layer of that as well to give it further structural strength. So I'm now ready to sand all this down. Now this stuff's pretty tough, so doing it by hand would be a bit of a chore. So what I've got here is a random orbit sander. And I have to say that if you are going to have a go at sanding this sort of thing down, one of these will save you hours and hours of really boring sanding. This stuff will cut through the fiberglass pretty easily. So as you can see, that's a start, but there's still quite a lot of indentations there, and it's not exactly completely smooth, so we've got a way to go yet. Now, the next step in this, what I'm going to do is actually give it a layer of car body filler. And what this is a two-part, I think it might be an epoxy. All you do is add a little bit of catalyst, as you can see there, mix it in, and then this stuff will set hard in a matter of minutes. The good thing is, though, that once it has set, is you can sand it down very, very easily, and it does sand to a very nice, smooth finish. So what I'm doing is using this to just fill in any gaps and cavities. As you can see, I'm doing it on the respirator here, but it's the same process for all of the pieces. Give it a layer, sand it back down, see how we're doing, perhaps add more sanding, rinse and repeat. So it's a bit of a laborious process, but you do get quite a nice result at the end. So here's the main piece after some car body filler and further sanding, and as you can hopefully see, that's looking a lot smoother than it previously was. And here's how it looks with the lens holders, so you can sort of see the direction this is taking. Now, one thing I often do if I'm sanding something down is to give it a layer of primer. Now that does two things. One, it's going to fill in any very tiny gaps, sort of air bubbles, things like that. But the other thing is, once it's all one uniform colour, it really lets you see where the areas you need to sand are. Areas that aren't quite smooth or areas which have got sort of small indentations will stand out and be much easier to see. So that's basically what I've been doing here, is sanding it down, giving it a layer of primer, seeing where else needs some attention, and just repeating the process. So the primer's now dry, and hopefully, as you can see, there are still some indentations and things here, and there's also some areas which where you can see a bit of an edge, so it does need a bit more of a sanding. I'm not going to get this entirely perfect. I do want it to have a degree of weathering to it, so I'm going to leave some of these defects in place, just so it looks like it's been around the block a bit, it's been used, it's been beaten up. I don't want it to look totally weathered and smashed to pieces, but I want it to look like it's had a bit of life prior to me wearing it. So as you can see here, I'm just giving it a bit of a hand sand, and I'm also just filling in some of these smaller gaps with some more car body filler. One of the more challenging areas to deal with were these raised sections which hold the goggle lenses in place. I essentially needed to sculpt the form here because it's a bit of an irregular shape. So what I ended up doing was using something called milliput, which is a two-piece epoxy. So basically there's two tubes of material, you mix them together and that sets them going, and you've got maybe an hour or so before they become hard, and this stuff really does become rock hard. The good thing is though, you can smooth it down with water while it's wet, and you can also sand it afterwards, so that was quite useful in getting those sort of difficult shapes. So there we are, that's more or less as far as I want to take it. What I'm now going to do is drill in some small bolt holes. I thought it would look quite cool if it had some of these hex nuts just embedded in it, as though these were the things that were attaching it to the actual leather mask. So what I'm doing is just drilling some small holes. I'm not going to glue the bolts in straight away, so I still need to spray paint this whole thing, but I need to drill the holes before I do the spray paint. So I think I'll leave it there for the time being. In the next part of the video, I'll look at painting up the mask and spray painting on my Union Jack design. I'll also look at sewing up the leather mask that all of these pieces will be attached to. But for the time being, that's it. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Ingenious devices keep me alive in perpetual motion. Thanks very much for watching. I'll be posting more videos on this project and others, so if you'd like to keep up with what's going on, please do subscribe. Alternatively, you can visit my website, which is www.thedarkpower.com, or you can find me on Facebook, just search for The Dark Power. Ingenious devices keep me alive in perpetual motion. These ingenious devices filled with the steam from 1,000 pistons. These ingenious devices